Imagine walking into a royal concert hall today, taking your seat, and looking at the stage to see that 50% of the musicians, literally half the orchestra, are playing the viola.
Which is just, I mean, it's completely unfathomable for us today.
Right. You would probably think there had been a massive scheduling error, or, maybe the violinists were on strike or something.
Yeah, exactly.
In a modern symphony, you might have, 10 or 12 violas sitting in a string section of 60? But in the French royal court of the 17th century, a 50% viola ratio wasn't a typo. It was the absolute, undisputed gold standard of the string section.
It really is a profound shock to our modern musical sensibilities because we are so conditioned to revere the brilliant, soaring upper register of the violin, right?
Oh, absolutely.
So the idea of an orchestra deliberately built around the dark chest voice resonance of the viola seems almost alien.
And that alien landscape is exactly where we're heading today. For everyone tuning in, especially the performers, string teachers, and students listening from the Viola Studio community, welcome to another deep dive.
It's great to be here.
Our mission today is to completely unpack Chapter 4 of Maurice W. Riley's seminal text, The History of the Viola, Volume 1. We are zeroing in on the 17th and 18th centuries, specifically tracking the incredibly volatile journey of the instrument across France and England.
And this is a period that fundamentally shaped everything about the viola as we know it. I mean, it dictated how the instrument is played, how its repertoire evolved, and even the physical, architectural dimensions of the wooden box you hold under your chin today.
Welcome to Viola Studio. We are a YouTube channel dedicated to the technical, pedagogical, and artistic development of viola students and instrumentalists. In every episode, our goal is to provide a concise and entertaining analysis. We will explore key themes, the messages of the great masters, and the historical context that shaped the sound of our instrument. Whether you are taking your first steps in the alto clef, or you are a professional seeking a new perspective, there is something for everyone at Viola Studio.
Don't miss our upcoming episodes, and remember,
there's always time to explore the history and the heart of classical music.
Okay, so let's unpack this. We have to start in France during the 1600s, which is often referred to as the French Golden Age. Because to understand the modern viola, you really have to understand what it meant to be an instrument of the middle.
Right.
We're looking at a period where the viola wasn't just present, it was the structural load-bearing pillar of the entire ensemble.
Yeah, the foundational text for this era comes to us from 1636. There was a scholar named Father Marin Mersenne who published a massive encyclopedic treatise called Harmonie Universelle.
A really important text.
Incredibly important. Mersenne was a brilliant thinker. He was a monk of the Franciscan Order of Minims, and notably a close correspondent with René Descartes.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, he was attempting to catalog and quantify the entire musical universe of France at the time.
And in doing so, he gives us this incredibly detailed snapshot of the official court orchestra of King Louis XIII, right? A group that had been established a decade earlier in 1626, known as the 24 Violins du Roi.
Exactly. And Mersenne was entirely captivated by this ensemble. He writes in Harmonie Universelle that the violin family as a whole is the king of instruments.
High praise.
Very. But when he describes the specific sound of the 24 Violins du Roi, he uses words like ravishing and powerful. And when we look at the actual orchestration, the seating chart, so to speak, we begin to understand how that immense power was generated.
Right. And this is where the math gets really fascinating, because if we hear 24 violins, we naturally default to our modern concept of an orchestra layout.
Sure. First violin's taking the melody, second violin's supporting.
Violas in the middle, cellos and basses on the bottom. But the 24 Violins du Roi used an entirely different acoustic blueprint.
They did. They employed a heavily bottom and middle-weighted structure. Out of the 24 players, only 6 were assigned to the dissus part.
And those are your violins operating in the soprano range.
Correct. And on the opposite end of the spectrum, you had 6 players on the bass part, which were the cellos playing the bass line.
Leaving a massive block of 12 players.
12 players entirely dedicated to the inner parts. Half the orchestra.
So mechanically speaking, and I think this is so crucial for the Viola Studio students listening, if you have 12 large, resonant wooden boxes vibrating in that specific tenor and alto register, what does that actually do to the acoustic space in a room?
It completely saturates it.
Right, because modern orchestras, particularly since the classical era, they prioritize the brilliance of the E string. They want a top-heavy cutting sound. But having 12 violas against only 6 violins feels like someone took the equalizer on a sound system and shoved the mid-range sliders to the absolute maximum.
That is an excellent way to visualize the physics of the sound. When you prioritize the parties du milieu, the instruments of the middle, as they were called, you are generating an overwhelming amount of harmonic overtones in the chest voice register.
Must have been so thick.
Incredibly thick, dark, and viscous. You wouldn't just hear this ensemble. You would physically feel the low-frequency vibrations resonating in your sternum. The French aesthetic of the time just fundamentally valued density and warmth over sheer brilliance.
And Mersenne also noted that these inner parts were referred to as les parties de remplissage, which translates roughly to the filling-in instruments.
Which is a tough pill to swallow today.
Yeah. For a professional violist today, being told your job is filling in sounds like a massive insult. It implies you're just, like, musical spackle.
Oh, our modern ego certainly chafes at the term. But in the context of early Baroque polyphony, filling in wasn't a derogatory concept at all. The harmony was viewed as an architectural structure.
Right.
The melody was the roof, the bass was the foundation, but the remplissage was the brick and mortar holding the entire building together. Without that thick middle layer, the music would just collapse into a hollow shell.
Now, here is a detail from the source material that I suspect trips up a lot of students and early career performers looking at French manuscripts. These 12 middle players weren't just playing one massive unified viola line.
No, they weren't.
They were divided into 3 distinct groups of 4, right? The Haute-Contre, the Taille, and the Quinte.
Yes, 3 distinct middle voices.
But Mersenne explicitly points out that the Haute-Contre, the Taille, and the Quinte were all tuned exactly the same way. CGDA.
Unison tuning.
Identical to the modern viola. So if I'm a student trying to wrap my head around this, it seems entirely illogical. If they're all tuned exactly the same, why give them 3 different names?
Well, it gets more complicated.
It does. Because even more bafflingly, why force the players to read from 3 entirely different C clefs? You have the Quinte reading soprano clef, the Haute-Contre reading mezzo-soprano clef, and the Taille reading alto clef. Why intentionally complicate the notation like that?
To understand that, we have to look through the lens of Kurt Sachs's research, which Maurice W. Reilly relies on heavily here. Sachs points out a fundamental cognitive difference between how we view instruments today and how the 17th century French viewed them.
Okay, how so?
Those terms, Haute-Contre, Taille, and Quinte, did not designate physical, separate instruments. They designated musical roles.
So they weren't building 3 different types of violas in the workshop. They were handing standard violas to players and basically telling them to assume different identities.
Precisely. And this ties directly back to vocal traditions. Instrumental music of this era was still inextricably linked to the choral tradition of the Renaissance.
Oh, that makes sense.
Yeah, you had vocal polyphony, soprano, alto, tenor, bass. When instrumental ensembles began to formalize, composers simply mapped those vocal ranges directly onto the string instruments.
It's like they viewed the viola not as a specific standalone machine, but as a wooden surrogate for a human singer.
It goes beyond just mapping voices, too. It completely rewires how a player conceptualizes their role in the counterpoint. In a choir, a tenor and an alto might occasionally sing the exact same pitch, but they are executing fundamentally different melodic lines with a different harmonic function.
Right, they have a different job in the chord.
Exactly. By forcing the Quinte to read soprano clef, the Haute-Contre to read mezzo-soprano, and the Taille to read alto, the composer was visually demanding that the string players think like singers in a polyphonic web. The clef didn't just tell you what notes to play, it told you your harmonic identity in that specific moment.
That requires a staggering level of theoretical fluency. Today we generally say, I play the viola, therefore my home base is the alto clef. But in Louis XIII's court, a player might be assigned the Haute-Contre line for a ballet, read mezzo-soprano clef all night, and then switch to the Taille line and alto clef for the next performance.
The baseline expectation for a professional string player's clef reading abilities was just remarkably high. They had to be musical chameleons, sliding seamlessly between different strata of the harmony.
Wow. But as glorious and thick as this 5-part viola-heavy structure was, it was completely upended by the arrival of one of the most ruthless figures in musical history, Jean-Baptiste Lully.
Lully is such a fascinating, polarizing figure. Born in Italy, he arrives in Paris in the mid-17th century as a young prodigy. He is ambitious, fiercely intelligent, and completely intolerant of mediocrity.
And apparently he thought the legendary 24 violons du roi were incredibly sloppy.
He did. He found their playing undisciplined and their rehearsal habits atrocious. By 1656, Lully is so frustrated with the establishment that he essentially bypasses them entirely.
He just starts his own group.
Yeah, he secures permission to create his own smaller elite ensemble known as Les Petits Violons du Roi.
It's the ultimate power grab. He creates a splinter cell orchestra where he has absolute tyrannical control.
And he wielded that control to institute a level of discipline that was virtually unprecedented. Lully demanded strict uniform bowings across the entire section. He mandated specific fingerings.
No improvising.
None. He insisted on precise execution of ornamentation. He didn't just want the musicians playing the same notes, he wanted them physically moving as a single breathing organism.
For the performers listening, think about the biomechanical implications of that. If you are sitting in a section of 12 inner strings and the director demands uniform bowing, he isn't just asking for everyone to play an up bow at the same time.
No, it's much deeper.
Right. He is dictating bow speed, contact point, the amount of arm weight used. He is constructing a unified section sound.
And that unified section sound became legendary throughout Europe. It was dubbed the à la Française style.
Which Djorkaeff ended up documenting in incredible detail, right?
Yes, Muffet was a highly respected organist and composer, and he spent 6 years in Paris specifically studying Lully's methods. Because Lully didn't always write his precise bowings or ornaments into the printed score, it was largely an oral tradition enforced through grueling rehearsals. Muffet's later writings are one of our only primary sources for how this highly disciplined music actually sounded in the room.
But Lully's obsession with clarity and discipline had a side effect. It started changing the actual architecture of the compositions. And this is where the ground starts crumbling beneath the violas.
We begin to see a slow but inevitable transition in the late 17th century. French scores from this era become frustratingly ambiguous. Instead of meticulously dividing the music into the dessus, contre, taille, and quinte, composers start using a blanket term.
They just write violon.
Exactly, just violins to indicate all the upper and middle string parts.
The source material explicitly points to the score of Lully's opera Cadmus from 1673 as an example of this. You look at the manuscript and it just says violons at the top of the page, followed by 4 staves of music above a bass line.
And while Lully's immediate contemporaries still occasionally wrote for the dense 5-part string choir, the trend was undeniable. By the mid-18th century, the 3 distinct viola parts, that glorious, ravishing Parties du Milieu, completely vanished.
Replaced by the standard 4-part harmony that still dominates today. First violin, second violin, viola, and cello. We go from half the orchestra playing the viola to just one designated line.
It is a massive structural shift in Western music. The aesthetic was moving away from the dense, woven counterpoint of the Renaissance. Composers were embracing a more polarized sound, so a brilliant, active melody on top and a strong, functional bass on the bottom.
The rich, thick middle was no longer the star.
It was hollowed out entirely.
Before we move on from France, there is a piece of scholarship mentioned in the outline that I think is absolute dynamite for the historically informed performance or HIP community. It concerns those transitional scores where Lully just wrote violins across 4 staves.
Ah, you are referring to Jürgen Eppelsheim's thesis.
Yes, because for a long time, prominent musicologists like Adam Kars looked at those 4-part Lully scores and assumed it meant first violin, second violin, first viola, second viola.
Which seems logical to modernize.
Totally logical. But Eppelsheim dedicated his doctoral dissertation to Lully's orchestration, and he proposed a radical alternative.
Right. Eppelsheim argued with substantial evidence that in early French scores, the second voice of a string choir might well have been played on a viola, not a second violin.
If I'm a conductor or a teacher putting together a Baroque ensemble today, that completely changes the game. But I have to push back a little on the physics of it. If a composer wants a second violin line, they generally want a taut, bright sound. If you play a second violin part on a viola, aren't you going to get a sound that is too thick? Doesn't the slacker tension of the viola strings muddy the upper register?
That is the modern assumption, yes, but we have to remember the context of the à la Française style. Lully wasn't looking for the piercing brilliance of a modern E string. He was looking for blend and warmth.
Oh, I see.
A second violin part played on the lower strings of a violin sounds tense, but that exact same part played in the upper middle register of a viola sounds incredibly sweet, relaxed, and deeply resonant.
That makes perfect sense acoustically.
Right, and Eppelsheim's thesis suggests that Lully purposefully utilized the unique timbre of the viola's upper strings to create a smoother bridge between the soprano melody and the bass. It is a really compelling argument for modern ensembles to experiment with assigning those secondary lines to the violas.
It gives a little bit of dignity back to the French viola section, before the four-part harmony took over completely. But if Lully's rigid control in Keres was slowly squeezing the viola out of the spotlight, the instrument was facing a completely different, almost existential threat across the English Channel. Let's look at the reality in 17th century England.
The English musical landscape during this period was entirely distinct from the French. To start with the nomenclature, the English didn't even use the term viola.
They called it the tenor, or occasionally the mean.
And those labels were highly literal. Just as the French mapped vocal ranges, the English term tenor explicitly indicated that the instrument shared the range of the human tenor voice. Mean simply referred to an instrument that played a middle part.
But the way the English physically constructed these instruments was wild. The source notes that while they had smaller tenors tuned to the standard CGDA, English makers in the 17th century were also experimenting with very large tenors.
Very large.
And some of these massive instruments were tuned a full octave below the violin.
That tuning is an acoustic anomaly.
I really need to break down the mechanics of this, because it sounds physically unplayable to me. A standard violin is tuned GDAE. If you drop that an entire octave, you are tuning GDAE down in the cello register.
Yes.
But you are putting those strings on an instrument that is played on the shoulder or the arm, not resting on the floor like a cello. How does a gut string, tuned that low on a relatively short body length, produce anything other than a slabby, inaudible whisper?
The short answer is it barely did.
Really?
Yeah. The physics of string instruments dictate that low frequencies require a large internal air volume and a long string length to project adequately. By tuning a shoulder-held instrument an octave below the violin, the English were pushing gut strings to their absolute slackest limits.
So it was just a terrible sound.
The resulting sound would have been incredibly soft, highly localized, and utterly incapable of projecting in a large hall.
So why do it?
Because the English elite in the early 17th century weren't playing in large concert halls. They were playing in intimate private chambers. And more importantly, this experimental tuning reflects a deeply ingrained cultural prejudice that defined English music at the time.
The war between the viols and the violins?
Exactly. While Italy, Germany, and France were rapidly adopting the fretless, loud, highly projective violin family, the English establishment stubbornly clung to the Viola da Gamba family, the viols.
For our listeners who might not have spent time with period instruments, a viol is a fretted string instrument, usually held vertically between the legs, with a flat back and a very different bowing technique.
And crucially, they produce a much softer, highly refined, almost silvery tone. The English aristocracy viewed the viol as the epitome of sophistication. It was the instrument of serious, contemplative polyphony.
And the violin family.
They viewed the violin family with utter disdain. Yeah, violins were loud, brash, and associated with lower-class entertainments. You hired a fiddler for a raucous country dance or a tavern brawl. You did not invite a violin into your parlor for serious music making. The loud projection of the violin family was considered vulgar.
That's hilarious.
So, attempting to tune a large tenor an octave down might have been a misguided attempt to mimic the darker, softer, less aggressive tone of a bass viol, trying to make the instrument socially acceptable to aristocratic ears.
It's fascinating how instrument design is dictated by social class. But this cultural stagnation was also heavily reinforced by the political chaos in England, right?
Oh, absolutely. The political environment was suffocating for the arts. The mid-17th century saw the English Civil War, the execution of King Charles I in 1649, and the rise of Oliver Cromwell as Lord Protector.
The Puritan era.
Under Cromwell's Commonwealth, from 1653 to 1658, theatrical performances were banned, and elaborate church music was stripped away entirely. Music retreated almost entirely into the private sphere.
So it was just chamber music at home.
Right, and in that highly restricted conservative environment, the quiet, private tradition of viol playing was the only form of string music that maintained respectability.
The tenor was basically trapped in a cultural deep freeze. But history hinges on small moments, and the pendulum swings back in 1660 with the restoration of the monarchy. Charles II reclaims the throne.
A huge turning point.
And crucially, Charles II had spent his exile at the court of Versailles in France.
He had spent years marinating in the opulence of Lully's Paris. He had heard the 24 violons droits, he had seen the ballets, the operas, the sheer sonic power of the violin family harnessed by the state. And when he returned to London, he was determined to replicate that exact aesthetic.
He didn't just replicate the aesthetic, he practically plagiarized the org chart. He created an ensemble directly named the 24 Violins of the King.
Unapologetically.
And then, clearly taking a page out of Lully's playbook, he established a smaller elite group called the 4 and 20 Fiddlers for his private entertainment.
And the sheer force of royal patronage overnight legitimized the violin family in England. Suddenly, it was no longer just the instrument of the tavern fiddler. If the king was paying 24 violinists to play at court, the wealthy amateurs and discerning musicians of London took notice. The violin became fashionable.
So you would assume this is the moment the English viola, the tenor, finally gets its due. The French style is imported, the violin family is respected, the tenor should thrive. But the source material reveals a much more depressing reality.
We can quantify exactly how neglected the viola remained by examining the publishing record of the era, specifically the work of John Playford.
Playford was essentially the primary gatekeeper of musical knowledge in London, right?
Yeah.
He published the definitive music manuals of the time.
Exactly. In 1654, right in the middle of Cromwell's rule, Playford published a brief introduction to the skill of music for song and viol. As expected for the era, it completely ignores the violin family.
In 1658, he updates it with a third edition and finally adds a section on how to play the treble violin. The violin has officially made it into print.
But he includes absolutely no instruction for the tenor or the cello. And it remains that way for decades.
Decades.
Yes. It is not until the 12th edition of the manual, published in 1694, that Playford finally bothers to include instructions for tuning the tenor violin.
That is a 40-year gap. 4 decades of the primary music publisher in the country acting as if the instrument simply didn't exist. And even when he finally includes it, the description is incredibly dismissive.
It really is.
He just writes, the tenor or mean is a larger violin than the treble and is tuned 5 notes lower.
Yeah.
And the clef is put sometimes on the middle and sometimes on the second line. It reads like an absolute afterthought.
It was an afterthought because, despite Charles II's attempts to import French orchestral density, the musical form that actually conquered London at the end of the 17th century was a highly streamlined import from Italy.
The Trio Sonata.
The Trio Sonata. The structural format was an extinction-level event for the English viola.
Let's break down the mechanics of the Trio Sonata, because the name itself is incredibly deceptive.
It is. A trio sonata does not mean 3 musicians. It usually requires 4 players to perform, but there are only 3 written musical lines. You have 2 melodic voices on top, almost universally assigned to 2 violins.
Okay.
And you have the basso continuo on the bottom.
The continuous bass line.
Right, which is typically executed by a cello or a Viola da Gamba, playing the written bass notes, while a keyboard instrument like a harpsichord or a plucked instrument like a lute improvises chords over that bass line to fill out the harmony.
If you look at that structural blueprint, there is a glaring omission. The entire middle register is gone.
The Trio Sonata is the ultimate realization of that polarized aesthetic we discussed earlier. High, virtuosic melody soaring above a strong functional bass. The inner harmonic texture, the remplissage that the French valued so highly, was deemed entirely unnecessary.
Because the harpsichord was doing it.
Exactly. The harpsichord player's right hand was expected to provide whatever faint inner voices were needed. There was simply no chair for a viola player in a Trio Sonata.
So practically speaking, if I am a professional violist trying to make rent in London in the 1690s, what are my options? I locked out of the chamber music scene because everyone is obsessed with Corelli's Trio Sonatas. Where do I find work?
Your primary source of income would have been the theater. But even there, the pickings were incredibly slim. The source points to Matthew Locke, a prominent English composer who wrote music for operas like Psyche in 1673 and The Tempest in 1675. Locke wrote for 4 part strings, which included a tenor part.
But the text is brutally honest about the quality of that part. It describes the tenor line in Locke's operas as little more than a harmonic filler.
It was musical drudgery. The violist was relegated to sawing away at whole notes in the mezzo-soprano clef, providing a stagnant harmonic drone while the violins executed all the brilliant, engaging material.
The only composer who seemed to throw the viola a lifeline during this dark age was Henry Purcell.
Purcell was a towering genius, and his approach to string writing was far more nuanced than his contemporaries. In his masterpiece, the opera Dido and Aeneas, composed around 1677, he specifically scored for 2 violins, viola, and bass. And he didn't just use the viola as a drone.
He actually gave the instrument moments of genuine contrapuntal freedom, right? The source highlights the accompaniments to the choruses in Dido and Aeneas, where the viola line is active, independent, and crucial to the emotional weight of the music.
He went even further in his 1691 opera, King Arthur, where he actually split the section and wrote 2 separate viola parts in the overture. For a brief moment, he resurrected the dense, middle-heavy texture of the old French style.
But Purcell's brilliance wasn't enough to turn the tide.
Sadly, no. Even Purcell was eventually swept up in the Italian fashion, adopting the Trio Sonata format for many of his own later instrumental compositions. Yeah, as Reilly concludes, the overwhelming popularity of the Trio Sonata was decidedly favorable to the violin, resulting in a dramatic, corresponding decrease in the use of the viola. The instrument was caught in an impossible crossfire projected early on by the conservative viol purists and later rendered structurally obsolete by the progressive Italian trends.
The viola in England was effectively a ghost. But historically, when an art form or an instrument is completely abandoned by the establishment, it creates a massive vacuum. And into that vacuum step the outsiders, the rogues, and the passionate amateurs who have nothing to lose.
The revitalization of the English viola didn't come from the royal court. It came from a grassroots movement of eccentrics.
And the first figure to kickstart this resistance was an Italian expatriate named Francesco Geminiani.
Geminiani is a vital transitional figure. He was born in Italy, trained under the legendary Arcangelo Corelli, but spent the vast majority of his professional life in London. In 1746, he published a set of Concerti Grossi, his Opus 7.
Now, for our students listening, the architecture of a concerto grosso is based entirely on contrast. You have a large ensemble, the ripieno, trading musical ideas with a small elite group of soloists known as the concertino.
In traditional Italian models, the viola was permanently anchored to the ripieno. It was a background accompanying instrument. But in his Opus 7, Geminiani did something radical. He extracted the viola from the back row and placed it firmly in the concertino group.
He put the viola front and center with the soloists. Now, I want to be historically accurate here. The source text is clear that these solo parts were modest. Geminiani wasn't writing blindingly fast arpeggios or punishing double stops for the viola.
Right, they weren't showpieces.
The parts were technically unpretentious compared to what the solo violins were playing, but psychologically, pulling the viola into the solo spotlight was a massive paradigm shift.
It was a proof of concept. Geminiani demonstrated that the viola possessed a unique voice that deserved to be heard individually, not just blended into the background. He was so convinced of this that he actually went back and revised his earlier Opus 2 Concerti Grossi to retroactively include viola parts in the solo sections.
Geminiani cracked the door open, but the next figure in the outline kicked it entirely off the hinges. And this is genuinely one of the most unexpected historical pivots I've ever read. The man who wrote the first viola concertos in England was William Herschel.
The man who discovered the planet Uranus.
Yes, a man whose name is permanently etched into the history of astronomy, who mapped the cosmos and has a literal planet on his resume, spent his early 20s trying to save the viola.
Herschel's biography is a testament to the fluidity of 18th century careers. Born in Hanover, Germany in 1738, he immigrated to England in 1757 to escape the 7 Years' War. While he's immortalized as a scientist, his primary profession during his early years in England was music. He was a highly capable violinist and oboist.
He actually played oboe in the Hanoverian Guards Band before moving to England. Once he settled there, he hustled like any modern freelance musician. He secured a steady job as an organist and choir director at the Octagon Chapel Church in Bath. He taught private lessons, he directed local concerts, and in his spare time, he ground glass for telescope lenses.
Just incredible energy.
And amidst all of this, in the single year of 1759, he composed 3 full concertos for the viola.
A concerto in C major, a concerto in D minor completed in August, and a concerto in F major completed in October.
3 concertos in a year for an instrument that publishers had ignored for decades. It is a monumental achievement, but we have to ask the critical question. What is the actual musical quality of these works? When an amateur astronomer writes a concerto, is it a hidden masterpiece or is it just, well, amateurish?
The source provides a very clear, nuanced evaluation from the musicologist Vincent Duckles. In 1977, Duckles presented a critique of these works, coinciding with the performance of the F major concerto at the 5th International Viola Congress in Rochester, New York.
So it was played in front of an audience of elite professional violists. What did Duckles conclude?
He was honest about their flaws. Duckles noted that the concertos demonstrate distinct technical shortcomings and are not mature works. The part writing can be awkward, and the structural development isn't on par with a Mozart or a Haydn.
Okay, fair enough.
However, Duckles heavily praised the works as ambitious, noting they possessed a surprising power and integrity.
And crucially, Duckles points out the influence of the North German school, specifically mentioning the Empfindsamer Stil.
The Empfindsamer Stil, or the sensitive style, is key to understanding Herschel's approach. This was a musical movement championed by C.P.E. Bach, characterized by intense emotional expression, sudden and dramatic shifts in mood, and a focus on intimate, vocal-like phrasing.
It was a direct reaction against the highly ornamented, somewhat superficial Rococo gallant style. For a performer, executing the Empfindsamer, still on a viola, is a very specific physical challenge. You aren't relying on flashy bow speed or pyrotechnics. You are relying on incredibly nuanced control of bow weight, subtle variations in vibrato speed, and the ability to pivot between a whisper and a cry in the space of a single measure.
It demands profound control.
Herschel clearly recognized that the dark, resonant, slightly melancholy timbre of the viola was the perfect vehicle for this sensitive, emotional style of writing.
Exactly. And the text emphasizes that despite any lack of supreme polish, Herschel deserves immense historical credit. He is the earliest known musician in England to recognize the solo potential of the viola and actually compose concertos for it.
If we step back and look at the sociology of this, what does it tell us that an amateur astronomer was a pioneer here? To me, it suggests that because the musical elite of London were entirely fixated on the violin, obsessing over the latest Italian virtuosos, the viola was essentially abandoned property.
It was completely ignored.
It was a blank canvas. Because no one in the establishment took it seriously, it became a safe space for passionate outsiders, tinkerers, and experimenters like Herschel to explore without intense critical scrutiny.
That is a very perceptive reading of the historical dynamics. The neglect of the establishment provided the freedom for the underground to innovate.
Which perfectly transitions us to the ultimate underground hype man for the English viola, William Flackton. If Herschel was quietly experimenting in Bath, Flackton was launching a full-scale public relations campaign in London.
William Flackton is an essential figure for the viola studio audience. Born in 1709, he spent his life in Canterbury working as an organist, a bookseller, and a composer of sacred music. And most importantly for our story, he was a devoted amateur violist.
Flackton looked at the commercial music scene in London and was horrified by what he saw. He realized that if you wanted to play a solo on the viola, you literally could not buy the sheet music.
It did not exist in the commercial marketplace. Faced with this void, Flackton took matters into his own hands. Between 1740 and 1760, he composed and published his Opus 2.
Which was a big deal.
Huge. This collection initially contained 3 sonatas for tenor and continuo, alongside 3 for cello and continuo. The publication was successful enough that in 1770, he composed and released 2 additional viola sonatas.
These works, sonatas numbers 4, 5, 6, and 8, stand as the earliest known viola sonatas published in England. But Flackton's legacy is not just the notes he wrote on the page. It is the text he wrote to the front of the book.
The preface to Flackton's Opus 2 is one of the most remarkable documents in the history of the instrument. It is a manifesto.
Let's analyze this preface because Flackton does not mince words. He is incredibly spicy for an 18th century English organist.
He opens by declaring his intentions with absolute clarity. The solos for a tenor violin are intended to show that instrument in a more conspicuous manner than it has hitherto been accustomed.
And then he unleashes a brutal, perfectly accurate description of how the viola had been abused by composers up to that point. He writes that the part generally allotted to it being little more than a dull ripiano, an accessory or auxiliary, to fill up or complete the harmony in full pieces of music.
A dull ripiano. That 2-word phrase perfectly encapsulates a century of frustration for English violists.
He goes on to complain that even on the rare occasions when a composer allows the viola to play a fugue subject or accompany a vocal line, it is never trusted to play alone. It is always doubled by the bass or the violins.
It's tragic, really.
Flackton writes, "If it happens to be heard, but in so small a space as a bar or two, 'tis quickly overpowered again with a crowd of instruments and lost in chorus." You can practically hear him shouting this. He's so tired of the viola being buried in the mix.
Flackton's footnotes in this preface serve as a vital historical record, too. He documents his own attempts to find repertoire, stating explicitly, "Upon inquiry at all the music shops in London for tenor solos, none were to be found, neither was it known by them that any were ever published."
He literally walked from shop to shop in London, asking for viola solos, and the merchants looked at him like he was asking to buy a unicorn. Because the market refused to provide for his instrument, he created the market himself. He wrote these sonatas to cultivate, in his own words, a higher veneration and taste for this excellent, though too much neglected instrument.
Flackton firmly believed that the viola possessed a particular delicacy of tone. He noted that the greatest masters acknowledged this beauty, yet the general public had never been given the opportunity to hear the instrument sing on its own.
And the incredible thing is, Flackton's one-man PR campaign actually worked. The source text notes a tangible shift in English interest following his publications. Just a few years later, composers began following his lead. A composer named Benjamin Blake started reliably producing viola music, publishing 3 albums of duets for violin and tenor between 1780 and 1785, followed by a duo for violin and tenor in 1790, and 3 solos for tenor and cello in 1795.
The ice was finally breaking. The viola was crawling out from beneath the crushing weight of the Trio Sonata and establishing its own solo voice.
But this musical revolution triggered a massive physical crisis. If composers are suddenly writing complex sonatas and concertos for the viola, the physical instrument itself has to evolve. You cannot execute the delicate ornaments of the Empfindsamer Stil, or the fast-string crossings of a Geminiani concerto on one of those massive, sluggish, octave-tuned tenors from the 1600s.
Exactly. The shift in repertoire demanded a radical shift in lutherie. The physical tools had to be redesigned to accommodate the new technical demands. Fortunately, the late 18th century saw the rise of some truly brilliant instrument makers in England who stepped up to solve this acoustic puzzle.
This brings us to a section that is absolute gold for our Viola Studio listeners, because we're going to get into the physical dimensions and structural engineering of these transitional instruments. Who were the heavy hitters building the English viola resistance?
The source highlights a lineage of exceptional English makers, starting with Daniel Parker, who worked roughly from 1705 to 1761.
Parker is a major figure because after initially copying the Amati patterns, he became the first English maker to heavily base his designs on the Stradivari pattern, bringing that Cremonese aesthetic to London.
Following Parker, we have Peter Wamsley, operating between 1715 and 1751. Wamsley initially favored the high-arch models of Jacob Stainer, which were immensely popular in England for their sweet tone, but he, too, eventually incorporated Stradivari's flatter, more projective designs. His surviving violas are considered highly desirable today.
And Wamsley passed his knowledge to his apprentice, Benjamin Banks, who set up shop in Salisbury and worked from 1727 to 1795. Banks is noted for making robust, large-size violas modeled both on Stainer and the grand pattern of Niccolo Amati, instruments renowned for their rich sonority.
But when we talk about redesigning the viola specifically to handle the new virtuosic solo repertoire, the most fascinating engineering solutions came from William Forster.
Yes, Forster, who lived from 1739 to 1808. He was a highly respected maker, eventually building instruments for the private band of King George III, but his violas featured a very specific, almost paradoxical design choice that initially seems totally counterintuitive.
Forster's violas were unusually short. The body length of a typical Forster viola is barely over 15 inches, which is approximately 38.1 centimeters.
Let's provide some context for how small that is. A modern full-size violin has a body length of about 14 inches. Today, professional violists routinely play instruments that are 16.25, 16.5, or even 17 inches long. So a 15-inch viola is incredibly small.
It is.
From a modern perspective, it's practically a toy. If you make a viola that small, don't you just end up with an instrument that sounds like a slightly muffled, squeaky violin? How does it maintain the dark, resonant C-string tone?
That is the exact acoustic problem Forster had to solve. The reason he built them so small was for playability. A 15-inch viola has a very short string length.
Which means less stretching.
Exactly. This means the left hand does not have to stretch uncomfortably to reach the notes, allowing the violist to navigate fast, complex passages with the same agility as a violinist. It was a direct physical response to the demands of Flackton and Herschel's new music.
Okay, so the small size gives you the agility of a gymnast. But how do you prevent the sound from becoming thin and nasal?
Forster compensated for the short body length by making the ribs of the instrument incredibly deep.
If the top and back plates dictate the length and width, the ribs dictate the depth of the internal air chamber.
Precisely. The frequency of the lowest resonant pitch of a string instrument is heavily dependent on the volume of air trapped inside the body. By artificially deepening the ribs, Forster massively increased the internal air volume without increasing the string length. He essentially tricked the acoustics.
That is brilliant engineering. He gave the player a small, easily navigable fingerboard for their left hand, but maintained a massive cavern of air inside the box to preserve the dark, booming chest voice resonance of the C string.
It was a very clever workaround.
But I imagine that creates a new problem for the right hand. If the ribs are that deep, doesn't it restrict the angle of the bow when you are playing heavily on the C string or the A string?
It certainly changes the clearance angles for the bow, forcing the player to adapt their right arm technique to avoid hitting the C bout. It was a compromise, but a necessary one for a transitional era. Forster provided a physical platform that allowed violists to finally act as soloists.
But Forster wasn't the only one catering to this new demand. The vibrant market for high-quality instruments in London attracted elite foreign talent as well, most notably an Italian master named Vincenzo Panormo.
Panormo brings the absolute highest tier of Italian craftsmanship into the English story. Born near Palermo in 1734, he is believed to have apprenticed with the legendary Carlo Bergonzi in Cremona.
So he possesses the direct, unfiltered secrets of the Cremonese Golden Age.
He opened a shop in Paris in 1760 and eventually relocated to London in 1772. Drawing heavily on the patterns of Bergonzi and Stradivari, Panormo crafted instruments that earned him an international enduring reputation. The source text actually provides us with the precise, millimeter-accurate dimensions of a specific Panormo viola built in London in 1813.
I want to look closely at these numbers because they confirm exactly what we've been discussing about the physical evolution of the instrument. The 1813 Panormo viola has a string length of 37.8 centimeters. The upper bout is 18.5 centimeters, the middle bout is 12 centimeters, and the lower bout is 23.2 centimeters.
They are exquisitely balanced proportions, typical of the finest Cremonese design.
But look at the body length. It is exactly 39.4 centimeters, which translates to 15.5 inches.
Only half an inch larger than Forster's models.
This is what blows my mind. You have Vincenzo Panormo, one of the greatest luthiers in Europe, working in London in 1813, taking commissions from elite professional players. And those players are explicitly asking him to build 15.5-inch violas. Why were the top-tier players of the early 19th century demanding such compact instruments?
If we synthesize the entire historical journey we've mapped today, the answer is inevitable. The viola was completing a massive crisis of identity. It had evolved from the French model, where it existed solely to play sustained, slow-moving harmonic filler in the Parties du Milieu, to the New English model, where it was expected to execute highly active, virtuosic solo sonatas.
They were demanding that the viola behave like a violin.
Exactly. The technical demands on the left hand had increased exponentially. The bowing techniques required for the Empfindsamer still were complex and varied. The players physically could not wrestle with the massive 17-inch or 18-inch tenors of the 17th century while trying to play a Flackton sonata.
It just wouldn't work.
No, the 15.5-inch Panormo was the ultimate solution. It was compact enough to allow for dazzling technical agility, but because it was crafted with Panormo's elite Italian understanding of arching and plate tuning, it still possessed the power to project in a concert setting.
It's a testament to the sheer quality of these English-made instruments. The Parkers, the Wamsleys, the Forsters, the Panormos, that they inadvertently became victims of their own success later in history.
A rather unfortunate footnote in the history of luthery, yes. The source notes that well into the 20th century, instrument dealers found it incredibly difficult to sell English-made violas simply because the market harbored an intense, irrational bias towards Italian names.
So the dealers engaged in some historical forgery.
They did. Many of the finest, most resonant violas built by Parker, Wamsley, Banks, and Forster had their original labels ripped out and were sold with fake Italian labels pasted inside.
It is the ultimate backhanded compliment. Your craftsmanship is so flawless, we're going to pretend a dead guy in Cremona built it so we can charge twice as much.
Fortunately, modern scholarship has corrected much of this, and the English makers of the 18th century are finally receiving the recognition they justly deserve. And Panormo's legacy in England continued directly through his sons, Joseph and George Louis, the latter of whom became a highly sought-after bowmaker, further equipping the English strings community.
So as we pull back and look at the massive expanse of history we've covered today, what does this all mean? We have traversed 2 centuries and 2 entirely different musical cultures.
We have witnessed an instrument undergoing a remarkable, oscillating journey of survival.
We started in the absolute glory of the French Golden Age. We saw the viola serving as the structural core of the massive, dark chest voice sound of Louis XIII's court. 12 violas, reading 3 different clefs, creating a ravishing, visceral wall of sound that literally shook the room.
A truly golden era for the instrument.
But then we saw Jean-Baptiste Lully institute ruthless biomechanical discipline, standardizing the bowings and inadvertently initiating the shift toward a polarized 4-part harmony that hollowed out the viola's middle kingdom.
We then crossed the channel to England, finding the instrument, the tenor, utterly marginalized. It was caught in a cultural crossfire, rejected by the aristocratic viol purists, ignored by publishers like Playford for 4 decades, and structurally erased by the mathematical architecture of the Italian Trio Sonata. It was reduced to a stagnant drone, a dull ripiano.
But then, in the darkest hour, the resistance formed, driven not by kings or elite prodigies, but by a patchwork coalition of outsiders. An Italian expat named Geminiani pulling the viola to the front of the stage. An amateur astronomer named Herschel writing concertos in his spare time, proving the instrument could execute the deep emotional nuances of the Empfindsamer Stil.
Incredible figures.
And an indie producer organist named William Flackton, who literally walked the streets of London searching for sheet music before writing his own manifesto to prove that the viola had a soul.
Supported, crucially, by brilliant luthiers who redesigned the physical architecture of the instrument, engineering deep ribs and shorter string length to allow the violist to finally step into the role of the virtuoso.
For the performers, the teachers, and the students listening right now on Viola Studio, I think this history deeply validates the modern struggle of the instrument. The viola has never had the steady, guaranteed red carpet pedigree of the violin. It is an instrument of constantly shifting identities. It has always required champions.
It really has.
It requires players who are willing to fight for their space in the acoustic landscape. When you sit down today and pull out a Flackton sonata, you aren't just playing notes on a page. You are actively participating in a 250-year-old act of musical rebellion.
That is precisely the perspective we should take away from Maurice Riley's research. And as we conclude, I want to leave our listeners with a final thought to consider, a historical thread that extends far beyond the 18th century.
What's the thread?
As the source text states at the very end of this chapter, 18th century England did not produce the ultimate world-renowned viola virtuosos. They did not generate the massive, overwhelming quantity of repertoire that the German composers did, nor did their luthiers completely eclipse the legendary status of Cremona. But what Flackton, Herschel, and Forster did was seed a movement of resistance. They kept the ember of the solo viola alive during its most vulnerable era.
They built the foundation.
Yes. So the question is this. If William Flackton had not stubbornly fought against the dull ripiano stereotype in the 1750s, would the legendary 20th century English viola renaissance have even been possible?
You talk about the era that gave us giants like Lionel Curtis and William Primrose.
Exactly. Did the struggles, the manifestos, and the amateur concertos of the 18th century lay the invisible psychological groundwork for the great English masters of the 20th century to finally elevate the viola to global prominence? And furthermore, if we look at our own modern orchestras today, are there other instruments sitting in the back rows, instruments we currently dismiss as mere harmonic filler that possess a hidden delicacy of tone, just waiting for their own William Flackton to unlock their solo potential?
That is an incredible question to leave off on. We started this deep dive expecting to find a clean, linear history of a wooden box. Instead, we found a murky, messy, beautiful evolution of an instrument that constantly refused to stay in its assigned place. To everyone in the Viola Studio community, keep exploring those inner voices, keep questioning the historical assumptions and the scores in front of you, and we will see you on the next deep dive.
Thank you for joining us, and we hope this summary and analysis have been of great help to you. Please remember that this is only a summary and can never replace the book itself. Therefore, we invite you to truly immerse yourself in the work by reading the original text. If this content was useful to you, please consider subscribing to the channel and hitting the notification bell. Remember, you can share this video with your friends to help our community continue to grow. Warmest regards, and remember, there is always time to learn and explore the world of classical music. a Viola studio production.